Hi, welcome. My name is Ron Gerard. I'm from the Leominster Historical Commission. I'm also a volunteer member at Leominster TV Access, and I'm also a volunteer member for the Leominster Historical Society. Last year, back around November, I had an idea about doing a movie documentary for movie theaters in Leominster on the early history of the theaters, and I had posted some information up on Facebook, our social media webpage, and I had a special person that came along, and her family at the time owned quite a number of movie theaters back in the early time frame of our history of movie theaters, and their name is Karen Byrne, and she comes in from Natick, and I'd like to welcome Karen back to the movie studio, Leominster TV Access. This is our last movie theater documentary that we had done. To my surprisement and to our surprisement, I got a call from Carl back around January, and he said, "Ron, I'm going to be giving you an award." And I said, "For what?" And to my surprise, you guys did a nice job on the movie theater documentary, so we had this award that they awarded us, and I'll be putting that up so you can show what the award was. And it was a movie theater documentary award, and I was really touched by it. And we had the luncheon back in February, I believe. Carl had a nice big write-up about me, and was saying a lot of nice things. So when he called me up to speak about the award and stuff, and the documentary and the projects that I was working on, I was really, really touched, and I couldn't say anything but thank you. And I just wanted to thank Carl and the LTV and the LTV family once again for letting us come in here and do this award before we start talking, and for the award that he gave us back in February of this past year. But anyways, without further ado, I'd like to introduce my guest, Karen Byrne. She comes in from Natick. Thank you, Karen, for coming in today.
Hi, Ron. It's my pleasure to be here with you.
And thank you.
The last time we did this program, we pretty much had just met a few minutes before we started.
Right.
We had no script, but we somehow managed to do a good job. Hopefully today we have done a lot more research, and we've studied up.
Yeah.
I feel like I've been preparing for a history test to get ready for this this program. So it's hopefully we'll give some more insight into what's been going on.
And
in
the two of
movie
us
theaters.
for the people viewing the audience, Karen has spent a tremendous amount of time between coming in from Natick to Leominster, spending time at the Leominster Public Library, going through microfilm, transcribing the microfilm, the new information that she's been able to come up with, and doing research at the Leominster Historical Commission. I've been coming up with a lot of new information to give to Karen, so it's kind of been working out really good. Your people are going to be really surprised to know in Leominster, we once had 15 movie theaters over the years that I've been able to count. If it's okay, Karen, I'm going to just read off some of the names I came across. The first known movie theater that actually played movies, and it wasn't the movie that you see today. They would have been played on what's called the glass slide, and I'll put a couple of glass slides up behind. And when I'm talking about the documentary, and Karen's talking about what's going on with the movie theater history, I'll be putting up video, and I'll be putting up photographs if I have them, and some history maybe with voiceover underneath some of the information that we have behind us, just so you guys know what we're talking about. And so anyways, the first one that actually had some type of moving picture was called the Town Hall, and the old Town Hall was burnt down in 1909. But prior to that, they started out in 1894 playing movie pictures. Well, they were called glass slides. And then we had the Wilkes Theater that came along around 1902. And these are not exact dates, they're about dates. Some are exact and some are not. Then we had the Pastime, the Music Hall, the Olympic Theater, the Gem Theater, the St. Leo's Hall Theater. That was an interesting one that I came across in 1916. Apparently they got involved with the same type of slides that the Town Hall did at the time. Then we had the Rialto Theater, the Sunshine Theater, the Capitol Theater, the Plymouth Theater, the Metropolitan Theater. The SAC theaters came along around the mid-1960s when Sears opened up. With the Searstown Mall at the time, I believe now it's called the Whitney Field Mall. It later became the Low Theaters, and today it's now called the Entertainment Theaters. And once again, I'll be having images and video behind of all this, so you can get a general idea of what we had for movie theaters in Leominster. Now, no, go ahead, Karen. I'll let you go ahead and talk now.
Okay. Well, Ron and I have met several times, and we finally agreed we all had different ideas how we wanted to present this. We decided we were going to do it in a chronological sequence, and Ron has just listed all the theaters that we're going to talk about as much that we happen to know. What I did since I last came, I have written about my family's movie theaters twice. Once when I was 13 years old in the 8th grade at Gallagher Junior High School, and again for my high school class newsletter. It was about a year ago. And I still have the original story I wrote back in 1958, I believe it was. And but I had the bibliography. I didn't have my notes. Back then, I went to the library and spent hours and hours with the microfilm back in 1958. I couldn't get copies of the newspapers then, but I could take notes. But the bibliography was still there, and the library still has the microfilm. So I went, and I want to thank Janine Levesque, one of the librarians there, who helped me learn how to run the microfilm machine. And this time I was actually able to make copies and printouts of the various articles that were in my bibliography. I took them home, and I couldn't get them all in one page necessarily, so it was kind of hard to read them. So what I decided to do, and this is a bunch of pages, I transcribed all the different articles that I read, so it made them easier to read. And the way the newspapermen wrote in those days was very verbose and very flowery, and many run-on sentences and commas just sprinkled everywhere. But still, the facts were there, and it was very interesting. So I've now added to the information that I was able to just remember the last time that I was here. And so we've already talked about the town hall. Ron found that theater. We don't know much else about it except that it was in the town hall, and they weren't
It was in the town hall. It was, I believe, we actually have a John Priati that Percy Johnson, I believe, was his father-in-law, and he had done a lot of, along with Edmund Davis, another earlier photographer in Leominster, and they were taking still images from glass slides, and we were fortunate enough that John had saved them over the years, and he came across some in New Hampshire that the Society had purchased. And so anyways, between the Society and the Historical Commission over the years, they took those glass slides, and they were negatives, and they put them on the flatbed scanner and scanned them. And those glass slides would have been going into a box, and with a huge light bulb that would have heated up to about 800-degree light bulb, projecting an image onto a screen, and they probably would have had an organist playing music. That's how I believe, from what I've been, the older history stuff I've been seeing on YouTube channels, that's how they would have been shown back in the early time frame before the first motion picture came along that actually had voice. And so, Karen, you talked about the let's talk about your early history first of all. That goes back to your family.
Okay,
How do you want to talk about?
My family first got involved in the theaters in Leominster in 1903. I could not find this particular article from my bibliography on the microfilm again, but from what I had originally, you mentioned the Wilkes Theater.
Yes.
The Wilkes Theater was not really a movie theater; it was a vaudeville theater. And my great-grandparents bought that theater from Mr. Wilkes and changed it into a silent movie theater. And at that time, the projectors were hand-cranked. So that was there and then they renamed it the Pastime. So the Wilkes Theater and the Pastime are one in the same location. But one was a vaudeville theater, and then they became a silent movie theater.
The Wilkes Theater and the Pastime, they were located in the Woodblock area?
The Woodblock on Central Street.
Now would that have been behind the Woodblock area, or where the parking lot is, or in the front?
No, right on the front. I assume it would be right in the front.
Okay.
They would have access to the main streets. People aren't going to go in the back doors to movie theaters, I would think.
But the reason why I asked you that, because many
of the movie
Plymouth
theaters
Theater, the way it was located on Mechanic Street.
Mechanic Street. When we talk about the Plymouth Theater in a bit, I have information about when it was constructed, and the Woodblock was involved in the construction of the Plymouth Theater.
Right.
Okay. So then we don't have the exact. 1907 was the first time we found any reference to the music hall, which was on Mechanic Street, and was originally owned by George Kendall. And it was a multi-purpose building. I believe there were stores and things on the first floor. It was a 3-story building, and the theater was originally just on the 3rd floor. And the 1907 article from the Leominster Enterprise was talking about Mr. Kendall renovating the building, taking out the 2nd floor, and moving the theater to the 2nd and 3rd floors. And in doing this, he was going to increase the capacity of the theater from 1,900 seats to 2,000 seats.
Wow.
Imagine, Leominster is a pretty little place back then, that 2,000 people would fill the music hall, and he showed silent films. He also had stage productions. Again, these things we're calling movie theaters were really full functioning theaters. They weren't just movie theaters. They could do stage productions and, just like a New York City theater. Plus, they had the movies.
Now, what people don't understand, when you say 1907, back in the time, and you think 2,000 people, that's an awful lot of people coming into Leominster watching movies or vaudeville. And they probably would have traveled by horse and buggy or by trolley. If there was, I think we had vehicles in 1907, but not many people owned them because they couldn't afford them. But it was quite interesting. Could you imagine today down in Searstown or the Whitney Field Mall now with 2,000 people sitting in a movie theater watching a movie? That's kind of mind-boggling when you realize the amount of people that would actually come into Leominster just to see the movies and vaudeville shows that we're putting on. I thought when you told me that, and I thank you for finding that information.
It was a big theater, so those are the things I got from the Leominster Enterprise. Now we move up to 1911. That's when my great-grandparents built the Olympic Theater on Pleasant Street. And I think it was like 19 Pleasant Street. And one article that I found, they showed movies there. I guess they had a regular projector by then. But there was, on May 12, 1913, the actress Pauline White, who was famous for a series called The Perils of Pauline, came to Leominster, and the newspaper article said that she went to Nickerson's dry goods store, which is now Allen's department store, same location, to make a purchase. The first lady to recognize her and accompany her to the Olympic Theater would receive a $2.50 gold piece and a complimentary movie pass good for 3 days. Wow. And Miss White was starring in a movie called Lovers 3 at that time. So you could go and see the movie free and get $2.50 gold piece. But in order to have Miss White appear at the Olympic Theater and go downtown to do a little shopping, they had to increase the ticket price to 10 cents. Wow. I don't know what the price was normally, but it went up to 10 cents.
10 cents. And once again, when I went back to the movie theaters, and I went inside the current theaters we have today, and I took a little B-roll, they call it B-roll video film. So I used my mobile camera, and I panned and zoomed around the concession stands and inside the movie theater before the screen was actually showing the movie, just to give people an idea from where we were to where we are now. And I found it pretty interesting. When you're talking about a $2.50 gold piece, can you imagine if somebody had that today?
The price value, a lot more than $2.50.
Yeah.
It's interesting that it wasn't like a $2 gold piece or a $1 gold piece, but it's $2.50 gold piece.
Yeah, no kidding.
So that's 1911. That's the kind of money people had. All right, now we move up to 1913. A couple of years later, I guess the Olympic went along quite well. So my great-grandparents, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas McAvoy, decided to open the Gem Theater, which was in the Hillary Block on Main Street. And that theater seated 654 patrons. We don't have any pictures of the Gem Theater. We thought we've come close to finding one, but there doesn't seem to be that much. Whoa. But I did find some information from opening night. And the opening night said manager T.A. McAvoy, that's my great-grandfather, stated that there would be no vaudeville acts at the new theater. In addition to movies shown on a gold radium screen, which is the newest model of moving pictures, they were going to have also the films were shown with something called a Power 6A camograph with dissolver and spotlight. Was going to be, I guess, he was Irish, so I guess he liked music and singing. So even though there was no vaudeville, he said there was going to be music and singing in every performance in addition to the silent movies. And on opening night, there was a 4-piece orchestra under the direction of Ernest Johnson to provide the music, and he was going to appear regularly at the theater after that. There was duet selections by Albert Liberty and Teresa Anderson, and 25% of the opening night profits were donated to the Leominster Hospital.
Right, and since I talked to Karen last, I've been scanning, when I go to the Historical Commission office, I'm typically there about 6, but sometimes 7 days a week because I thoroughly enjoy what I do. And I scan and document and catalog images into a program called FileMaker, which I taught myself with a little help from Carl Pemariti, which I want to thank him for that again. I was scanning the World War I stuff this past week because of being Veterans Day. And I came across an interesting article, which I'll put up on behind us. But I found, I was really excited. Anyways, I'll put this up so you guys can see it later. But it's called the Gem Theater. And this is the actual flyer from the Gem Theater. And it says basically the Gem Theater, the one bright spot in Leominster today. It's got 2 gemstones on the top. and the shape of the arch, and how this would have been the actual neon sign in front, and they would have had a sign down the middle that would have been vertical, and it would have said gem, and it would have been all lit up in neon. And well, what this flyer says is the Welcome Home celebration in motion picture. This had to do with the World War I when the war ended and the guys came home from the war. Yesterday, Leominster did herself proud in welcoming home victorious heroes. Today, the Gem Theater take great. Let me get my bearings straight again. I'll reread this because I have a little hard time sometimes reading. Yesterday, Leominster did herself proud in welcoming home her victorious heroes. Today, the Gem Theater takes great pride in showing the authorized official motion picture in Leominster's greatest celebration. Your Boys, Neighborhood, Your Boys. Continuous performance at 6:30, doors open up at 7. Note, the cost of this picture was so great that the entertainment committee could not have sufficient funds to meet the expense, but the management of the Gem always ready to help worthy cause and realizing its important historical value and the pleasure it would give its patrons to see the wonderful event of this motion picture, volunteered to stand in the whole experience knowing their patrons would be gladly pay the slight increase. And the slight increase went from 10 cents to 25 cents. And oddly enough, Karen and I was talking about this film, and Karen said, talk to me about the film that you donated to the society. We suspect it's this film that they played over here.
Well, because I later on want to talk about my family, but my grandparents met at the Gem Theater.
Right.
My grandfather was a soldier in World War I, and he was at Camp Devens, and he came to Leominster and met his future wife. So obviously the theater would be interested in the people coming from World War I. We had we had two artifacts from the theater. We had this can of film, which I never saw. I didn't even know we had it until my parents were talking about it. And my mother and father said, we should donate this to the Historical Society, which they did. It had to be before 1980 because that's when my mom passed away. And it was their 35 millimeter film, which could have been from World War I. I know it was a parade from a war. It may have been World War II, but
it was from. I don't mean to interrupt and correct you, but it was from World War I because what happened was the Victory Celebration Parade in Leominster. It was a 3-mile parade, and we have photographs of that parade. And the parade video is at the society, but
from World War I.
From World War I, and I talked to Linda and I talked to Pinder and Linda Pinder and Mary Murata. They think they have it somewhere, but we're going to be searching for it over the next few weeks.
I knew we donated, and when I saw this article here about the Gem Theater, maybe that's the one we had because the theater paid for it and they showed it, and maybe we still kept the film. It was stored in the theater someplace, and somehow it was given to my mother.
Right. If people don't know what Karen's talking about, the reel is a 2-inch thick reel, and it's I forget the millimeter film.
35, I guess. Yeah, later, 16 millimeter came in later.
Something like that would have had been transferred over to a company out in Connecticut to do the video transferring because I believe LTV's not quite set up for that over here, but
at least we're looking for it.
But we're still looking for it. So when I find it, I'll pass it off to Kyle and the LTV family.
Yeah. So I'm not sure. I know it was from a parade from one of the wars. I'm not sure which one it was, but if they can find it, maybe it's not something that's never been transferred.
Right. And for people who don't know the Gem Theater, where it was located, Karen and I figured out that it was located on Main Street, and it would have been where the Hillary Block is, and where the Hillary Block was. It was in between where now the Bank of America is and where there was a church in that area and where the Fidelity Bank is.
Church was a little further down.
Yeah.
It's essentially across the street from the Richardson building, which is 20 Main Street. And it's a parking lot
And once again, today I got video we'll be putting up behind it so you can get an idea where it was while we're talking about all this great stuff today.
Okay, so I guess we've taken care of the Gem. Now, the next thing we have in 1916, St. Leo's Hall had movies. I don't know anything about that. Did you have any information?
I didn't have any luck finding any general information about it. All I just know is one day I'm going through all our directories and I came across the St. Leo's Hall. They asked Linda about it at the society. She wasn't too sure about it. But I did find the location. And now, you were thinking about St. Leo's Hall today where it's currently standing. We had another building adjacent to it as you're going up Main Street to the left of it. And once again, I'll put a picture up of the actual building where that was shown, so people get an idea of where it was in that location. But and if I come across any more through microfilm at the through the library's help there, I'll pass the information along. But we'll go on to the next one now.
Okay, so up to 1923.
Okay.
And I guess my great-grandparents were feeling very successful from the Gem Theater and the Olympic Theater that they decided to build another theater, and they built it on Main Street. It's either 53 or 55 Main Street. It's the corner of, I guess that's Merriam Avenue, right across where W.T. Grant's was. And the building is still there today, so that's the only one that survived. But this was quite a magnificent building. It cost over $200,000 back in 1923. The architects were Funk and Wilcox, and we do have the architect's drawing of this, which my family has donated to the Leominster Historical Society. And we had a copy that I had made when we donated it for us to keep. And just a couple of weeks ago, my brother and I donated it to the Christian Life Center. Right. So now they have a copy of the original architect's drawing of the building that they're still, maintaining and taking good care of. Okay, so the capacity of the Rialto Theater was 1,400, and on opening night it was filled to capacity, and according to my uncle Edward McAvoy, who was listed as the general manager of the theater, 1,500 patrons were turned away.
Oh, wow.
So they had a full house, and they had equally as many people outside trying to get in. So obviously everybody in Leominster liked to go to the movies. But you didn't just see the movies when you went to one of these kind of programs. They called them playhouses rather than movie theaters back then. So 2/3 of the patrons on opening nights were guests of the management, including Mayor Sawtell, members of the City Council, and the Chamber of Commerce. Getting ready for opening night, I guess, was quite frenzied, because according to the article in the newspaper, said members of the management, which include all my great-uncles, my great-grandfather, and my grandfather, spent 42 straight hours working to get everything in place. They also had the contractors, particularly the electrical contractor, whose name was Joseph McGinnis. And this man worked for 42 hours, and they brought meals into them so they wouldn't have to take any time off. And the chandelier, which weighed 1,800 pounds, and had 205 lights, was hoisted to the ceiling 5 minutes before the box office opened.
Wow.
So they were really cutting it close, but I guess everything worked out. And the opening, now, all these theaters had these organs, and all the ones in Leominster appear to be the Robert Morton organ. That company is in California, and they provided, and this was a fantastic organ. And the program started with a recital on the organ, followed by the Rialto News Weekly, then a high-class educational comedy entitled Pardon My Glove. Next was a stage performance by Grace Hushion and Myers Arthur. This was followed by the feature picture of the evening, Back Home and Broke, starring Thomas Meehan. And finally, there was an exit march played on the organ to close out the program. So that's quite an extensive program.
And you had sent me I had found some photographs of the organ that you're talking about, and the layout of what the Rialto Theater looked like. And can you imagine that chandelier? I mean, that must have been a spectacular thing to see when you came into the theater and said, wow, And like you said, they had to turn back 1,500 people on opening night. That must have been.
No, they spared the place was quite lavish. There's still, even today, there are still the marble floors, and it was, they spared no expense to make an absolutely beautiful, full functioning theater. It had a full stage. It had it didn't have an orchestra pit. We decided it was just in front, but there were places underneath for actors.
Right.
And they had vaudeville. Vaudeville was still going. So vaudeville and a movie. You didn't just get a movie back in those days.
What about those? I came across some plays for Foster Grant. Putting over there?
Yeah, that's another thing. I'm getting to that. There's a couple of things further, but also in the article about opening night, it said that the Albert McAvoy, who was one of the sons, who actually wasn't really part of the family business, went off on his own. But at this time of the Rialto opening, he was the manager of the Progress Film Company in New Haven, Connecticut, and he was going to be booking novelty and stock companies for the new theater. So they weren't planning to just show movies; they were still going to have live performances.
Okay.
So that was it. Now, the next part I want to talk about is something I call the gong story.
Yeah, that was pretty interesting. Karen sent me a video of the gong, the actual gong that was in the Rialto Theater. I'll let it explain about it, and I'll put the video up behind me. It took me a while, and us a while before we finally got it off of social media, but it was pretty interesting. Go ahead, I'll let you talk about the gong.
Facebook, I mean, it brought me to Ron, but it also brought me to a whole bunch of my McAvoy cousins, who most of whom I've never met. But I was here, they're a lot younger than me, so they interested in knowing about the family business, but they really didn't have anything to do with it. So one of my cousins, whose name is Frederick McAvoy, but he goes by Rick, he lives in Hawaii, and he became one of my Facebook friends, and he told me he had this gong that he had taken off the wall of his grandmother's summer home in Lake Winnipesaukee. And his grandmother was married to my Uncle Arthur, so he's, and she was my Aunt Nellie, so she was in the family. And he had taken, and his father had told him that that gong had come from some theater. We've decided it's the Rialto Theater, and that, this organ was there, so that was always a part of the program every evening or every afternoon.
Right.
So most programs would start with an organ recital. And then when it was time for the organ recital to end and the movie to begin, someone would come out on the stage and bang this gong to say, this is now time for the movie to start. And that's how the organ came in. So Rick lives in Hawaii. He made it. First he just sent me the picture of the gong, which I said, well, we'd like to hear what it sounds like. So I got him to make a little video, and Ron now has that video. So we have Rick McAvoy banging the gong.
And once
so
again, that'll be behind us playing while we're talking.
Time for the movie to start. So and then there's another interesting thing, something that Ron discovered has to do with the blue laws. Movie theaters were affected by the blue laws because they were open on Sundays because that's, people had the day off. And it appears that they could not open the theater on a Sunday and show movies without a special license, which they had to get every single week from the mayor of Leominster.
Right.
And Ron found this letter on a letterhead stationery. It said Plymouth Theater and Rialto Theater, and it was written by my great-grandmother, Rosina Lee McAvoy, and her signature's on the bottom. And she was complaining to the mayor about the cost of this weekly fee that she had to pay to keep the blue laws. And what she was saying was that her fee was based on her gross receipts, and now she was operating 2 theaters, and her expenses were higher. And also the talkies cost a lot more to rent. So she was proposing that the fee be based on her net income rather than her gross income. So the blue laws, in Massachusetts, blue laws affected the movies. Movies could not have been open on Sunday if they didn't pay for this license.
And once again, as I catalog and document images and when I'm at the Historical Commission, for instance, I came across a 1943 program from Fitchburg and Leominster when football time, when they were playing football back in 1943. And in the program itself, I'll come across ads for these theaters or whatever, and this is where I'm finding a lot of this information, and sometimes even photos that we didn't have before. And those programs are nice because it's showing sponsorship in the back, who sponsored these articles, these programs, and it tells you what went on in Leominster back in that time frame. This is why I love doing what I'm doing. And so I'm going to let Karen go ahead and continue talking about
so still the Rialto, and you alluded to this, that they did have all kinds of different performances going on. They had the organs, they had the vaudeville stuff, but they also hosted plays and musical productions by local groups.
Yeah.
And you actually have some programs.
Yeah, we do. I found about 6 different programs that I had scanned and cataloged, and they were pretty interesting how they would put structure to put together, just like our iPads today, except they're in paper form. And like I said, they had the sponsors in the back room, in the back of the book, that sponsored the books and supported the plays that came out, and the history about the play and who acted in the play and what the play was about. And that was all pretty interesting. And I'll put some of those up behind us so you can get an idea what we're talking about.
So there were, I think the Foster Grant Employees Association did 6 or 7 programs there. And Zamir Shepard, who is an icon in Leominster, at least he is to me, he ran the recreation program for the Foster Grant Company. I never would have got to see live theater originally, and he would take buses of us to Boston to see things, all sporting events, all kinds of really cool things. And he also was a fabulous tennis player, and everybody took tennis lessons from him. So Sheffy was an amazing man, but he was also directed the Foster Grant
Right.
shows that they put in. And one of the shows, my dad, who worked at Foster Grant, was actually in the show.
Oh,
And
wow.
We've got, we have a program that he's one of the cast members.
Wow.
So that's kind of interesting. And I guess DuPont employees also put on performances there, as did St. Leo's Parish.
Okay.
And the Leominster High School senior class play was conducted 2 or 3 times at the Rialto Theater.
Okay.
One year, 1931, their grandson, Earl McAvoy, was one of the cast members. And
Wow.
the performance was done at the Rialto Theater. They did charity fashion shows, and there were even boxing matches. I found different ads about boxing matches. So that's good.
Now, you said that in the upcoming next paragraph that the theater's closed down at a short period of time?
That's the part that I moved to a different
You
place.
moved to a different
That's I
location.
gave you my new, my new copy.
That's a new copy. All right, I'll let you go. Go ahead.
I didn't make sense to close the theater as well
Okay,
before
I
we
get
get them
you.
all
Okay,
open.
go ahead and just, I'll let you keep
Okay,
going
so
with
then,
it.
all right, so my great-parents, they're still going strong here. In 1923, they opened the Rialto, which was a brand-new building that they built from scratch, and the music hall, which we've talked about earlier,
Okay.
for some reason in 1923, they decided to buy the music hall, have another theater. Originally, it was owned by George Kendall. They bought it from a person named Charles O. Amazine. So I don't know when Mr. Kendall sold the building, but he did not own it in 1923 when my great-grandparents purchased it. So and they just remodeled it and opened it to the public. And now they started to get some competition. You've got in here between 1926 and 1933, we have the Sunshine Theater, which later became the Capitol. And I'm thinking that perhaps that was the same building where the Olympic had been,
it was.
somebody else just took it over.
Yeah, when I did my research where it was, I'm looking at it, and all of a sudden I'm seeing like Sunshine Theater. Okay, never seen this advertisement in the city before. And then Capitol Theater. Now, the Capitol Theater, when I went to a diner in Leominster, Don's Diner, actually, he had that particular poster in the Capitol Theater, and it had what was playing at that time. And I have images of all this. Once again, I'll be putting that up so people can understand what I'm talking about.
So we do know the Capitol was there. And I did find one article, it was just like a little news thing that talked about in February 5th, 1929, the Capitol Theater was playing a movie called The Perfect Crime, which was a screen version of a novel by Israel Zangwill called The Big Bow Mystery. And it was considered an outstanding mystery drama of the year. Clive Brooks and Irene Rich were the stars. There was also another cast member named Little Jane Laverne. I'm assuming that was a little girl.
Now, when Karen's talking about The Perfect Crime and some of these movies from that time, you can research these on YouTube, and they do come up, and so you can get an idea on what she's talking about and what people would have saw back then. I can't use any of that video because it's copyright, but I just, unless I had all kinds of writing that I could use it, but I just wanted to let people know that where they can look at that if they want to have to look it out. It's kind of fun going back and seeing what they would have saw back then with those movies and how they would have viewed them in black and white.
So now it looks like we've got a few theaters going in Leominster. We have the Sunshine, or the Capitol. We've got the Rialto. We've got the Music Hall.
Right.
Those are all functioning theaters at this time. And we get to 1927 when things got a little shook up. About midnight in September of 1927, the Music Hall caught on fire, and it burned to the ground. So that kind of closed up one of our theaters.
Yeah, Roger Lapointe, one of the firemen, he gave me all the images and the written history of that and how it happened and everything. And I'll put some of that up so people will understand and show you what it looked like before and afterwards. And
Well, a couple of the pictures actually belong to me. They came out of my family scrapbook, and I gave them to the Leominster Historical Society.
Yeah, and Roger has them, so he gave them to me, so we have them anyways.
It was quite a disaster, I guess. It burned totally down. But in one of the flowery newspaper things, said before the ashes were cold, Mr. and Mrs. McAvoy decided to build a new theater on the site. And this was in 1928. We have the Plymouth Theater, which was named the Plymouth Theater because my great-grandmother was born in Plymouth, England, so it was named after her. So they built that theater. In less than a year, they built the theater.
Yeah, I saw your notes that you had from the actual newspaper clipping, and it was pretty interesting. All the employees they had going on because they wanted to get it built, and I'll let you continue talking.
So there's an aerial photo that shows the whole Plymouth Theater.
Right.
The Plymouth Theater, without seeing it it was really pretty big. I had,
Right.
2 lobbies, and then the auditorium, and then the stage, and
Well,
probably
Karen
covered a
was just
couple
talking
of
about
blocks,
the
but to
aerial
build that-
photograph in the film documentary that Kyle came across, 1938, that Leominster happened in Leominster. There's actually a small little video that probably about maybe a minute long, and it actually shows the Plymouth Theater on the side angle, and it's pretty interesting. And I'll put that short little video clip up so you can get an overall a view and an idea in your minds what it looked like on Mechanic Street and how far out was it to the street. And I thought that was pretty interesting too on that.
But it wasn't quite as big as the Rialto, but it was pretty large. So they wanted to get it built quickly, and the contractor had over 100 men working. They had 40 who laid the foundation. Then this is the woodblock. We talked about this earlier. The woodblock, they rented out the rear of the woodblock to make workrooms, for use by the construction workers. They had 35 carpenters and 35 bricklayers and plumbers and electricians. So, and also they wanted to make sure this building couldn't burn down. Right. So they made great care in making it fireproof. I think there was 6 carloads of concrete that came in to make sure it was a fireproof building. It was very elaborate, and I did grow up in the Plymouth Theater. Okay, it was around until 1962. I spent my childhood there, and I actually worked there, so I'm quite familiar with it.
I actually remember going into the Plymouth Theater a couple of times, and I was about 7 years old.
Mm-hmm. I'm a lot older than you. But they were marble floor. The outer floor, the outer lobby, which is where the ticket booth would, had 2 starburst chandeliers, which, according to, I didn't know this before, came from the Christian Science Temple in Boston.
Oh, wow.
So I guess they were getting some new fixtures and they were selling them. My Uncle Arthur went down and got these 2 chandeliers, which were considered to be artwork. So those were in the outer lobby with the marble floor. The inner one was a rotunda, and the floor was circular. And again, there was another chandelier in the center of that. And that chandelier had, I don't know how many lights there was in that one, but it was in the dome ceiling. And that was quite interesting. The main auditorium of the theater the walls were paneled, and I remember on each side there were these 20-foot English tapestries, and my great-grandmother was English, and they were like hunting scenes, but they were very large, and they were on the walls and on both sides. This theater had 1,350 seats, and the seats were especially designed from the ones used at the Roxy Theater in New York City and all the Paramount theaters throughout the country. So they didn't just get any old seats. They also didn't put as many seats in as they could. There was a certain distance that you had to have for the fire laws, but they chose to put the rows a little farther apart so that if you were in the middle of a row, you didn't have to make everybody else stand up while you could get out of the row. So they're trying to make it comfortable for the patrons. Okay, the projectors that they had were something called Movie-Tone and Vitaphone. Someone tried to describe those later on.
I actually found video of those on YouTube there. I don't know if I can use the video or not without copyright.
Well, eventually they got sound involved in there, but those are the kind of projectors they had. And because of the flammable nature of the nitrate film, they were especially concerned about having a fire in the booth where the movie was shown from. So they took special care. They had special fire doors and shutters. And this is a quote from the newspaper. Said, "The projection booth could be a raging furnace, and not even a puff of smoke would get into the audience." Wow. So they really were very concerned about fire when they constructed this theater. So they got it all built in a year. And so the stage had sufficient apparatus to handle any kind of production, including a Broadway musical. So this is a full theater, not just nowadays the movie theaters, you have seats and you got a screen. This one, they were full stages, and they could do all kinds of things, not just show the movies. Okay. Now, again, I guess they were really feeling their own, so they had a lot of spare money. At the same time they were building the Plymouth Theater, they decided to renovate the Rialto Theater. The Plymouth Theater also had a Robert Morton organ. I never knew that it never had an organ in my lifetime, but it had one installed back in 1928 when the theater was built. And I guess they were buying a new organ for the Plymouth. They decided they would replace the organ in the Rialto. So the organ that they had after 1928 in the Rialto was not the same one. And it was supposedly, according to the Robert Morgan salesman. He says the finest organ that he had ever installed in New England. So it was quite big. They also it had 700 more pipes than the first organ did. So it was, and I kind of noticed in the ads that they call it the Robert Morton organ in the early ads, but later on I didn't know why they started calling it the Wonder organ, because it was a big organ. So I don't know. I assume they traded in the first organ. I don't know what happened to it. We do know that the organ that was there when the theater closed went to a church in Worcester. We don't know what church that was, but we do have that information. Okay, so they decided to recarpet the whole theater. They ordered 1,000 yards of Bigelow theater carpeting.
Wow.
That's a lot of carpeting.
Yeah, no kidding.
That's like 10 football fields.
Wow.
So the 1,000 yards of carpeting, they repaneled, they revelveted, they polished the brass, they got new stage decoration. And for some reason, the clocks were placed in a more attractive position.
Okay.
I don't know where the clocks were before, but that seemed to be a problem. And so they planned to have these redecoration completed by Easter Sunday so that they could conform to, you get your new Easter bonnet, you come out on Easter in a new outfit. So they were going to have the theater all finished. So they were renovating the Rialto, building the Plymouth. That must have been a pretty busy year in 1928. The Plymouth, however, was supposed to open on October 1st, 1928. It did not, because there was a delay. The fire escapes had not arrived for the building. Right. And obviously, considering the building has recently burnt down, you want to make sure the fire escapes are attached before you open. And plus, the inspectors would not allow the theater to be open. So it took an extra 10 days, and the theater finally opened on Thursday night, October 11th, 1928. It had a 5-act vaudeville performance, a super feature motion picture called The Racket, again starring Thomas Meighan. He was very popular, and an organ recital on the new organ done by E. May Eastman, who was the director of music for both the Rialto and the Plymouth. And they also hired a new musician to do the organ. His name was Ernest Metcalf. We're going to hear about him again a little bit later on. He was a Leominster native, and he worked with Ms. Eastman, and they alternated playing of the two different. Sometimes she would play at the Plymouth, and sometimes he would play at the Rialto.
Okay.
So they had two organists and 2 organs.
Wow.
Okay. The movie-tone projector that was described in the newspaper said it was an invention whereby the light waves from the projector and the sound waves of the radio are synchronized, and one hears all the natural sounds taking place on the screen. Don't know exactly what that doesn't tell me too much more information, but the first talking picture happened at the Plymouth Theater on February 4th, 1929, and they had to update. The new projector was called Vitaphone, Movietone, all one together. I guess originally there were 2 different separate ones, but they got put together in one thing. Cost $14,000. It weighed 1.5 tons. It took 5 weeks to install the equipment to have the first talking movie.
Now, $14,000 back then, that was a lot of money.
That's a lot, yeah.
People don't realize in today's equivalent value to what they were talking about, what Karen's talking about.
Yeah, so they spent a lot to do that. So the first movie they had was called Interference. It starred Clive Brook, Evelyn Brent, and William Powell. And it was said that William Powell, of all the actors in the movie, William Powell had the best voice for sound movies. His voice was resonant.
When I read some of this off to some of the guys that I volunteer with, the names that Karen just mentioned, they told me about all that, and they recognized all those names and remembered all those movies you were talking about.
Well, good for them. William Powell was around for a long time, so I do remember.
Correct me
up. So then the newspaper article said, that was the first movie that they had, and it said in the following week they were going to have The Singing Fool, which starred Al Jolson.
Okay.
Now, I have always kind of thought that was touted as being the original talking movie.
Yeah.
It wasn't the original talking movie. It was the first talking movie that had singing in it. So that's what made it different. So that movie came to Leominster a week after Interference did. And then later on, they were going to have the first outdoor talking pictures. I assume it must have been difficult to get the sound going if you filmed outdoors. So there were 2 movies called The Tenderloin and The Old Arizona, which were going to play later on. Those were outdoor talking movies. So they got very progressive in their activities with the movies. Okay, now we're ready to, we got the Plymouth opened. Now we got some competition. Okay, so the Capitol Theater was run by somebody else. We still don't know who owned that. But I know that wasn't my family. But the Metropolitan Theater, which was our biggest competition, it kind of sounds like from some of the articles I read that they were really trying to compete with us. This was a theater that was opened in 1929, and it was built by a man named Frank Traja. Later, it was owned by the Latches family. I don't know when they got to own it. But Frank Trager was an interesting character. I'm going to skip again. We'll talk about him first before I do that. He came to Leominster. He was a real estate developer. He originally, in about 1914, bought some property in Leominster and renovated it into an apartment house, and then kept buying other properties and fixing them up. Finally, in 1919, he moved to Leominster, and he was an employee of the Leominster Button Company, which was later known as the Leominster Shellgood Company. So then he's here. And in 1920, he built his personal residence on Lancaster Street. I don't know exactly where that was. Maybe we can find out. It was said to be one of the most beautiful homes in Leominster. And in 1924, he got into the contracting field, and he was a member of the company that built the Sawtell Bridge on Mechanic Street. And for several years, he did road construction, but then he started buying more properties in Leominster. One on Mechanic Street, he bought the Lockheed property, which he raised the buildings and built the Trager block.
Oh, wow.
And I think that's across the street from the Plymouth, where the Plymouth Theater was.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's since burnt down as well.
Once again, I'll be putting up images of what Karen's talking you guys about, where all this stuff that's located, so you get an idea in your head
so
what she's saying.
So this had eight stores, 3 apartments, offices, a bowling alley, and it was the home of the Leominster area of Eagles. So that was quite the place. So he was really a contractor. So he's building all these lovely places in Leominster, renovating properties. He decided he would purchase the Chadwick property, which is on Central Street.
Right.
And this was a big building and 2 small buildings. He raised the 2 small buildings, and that's where he built the Metropolitan Theater.
Now, when Karen's talking about Central Street, the Metropolitan, that was now where not CVS, but Walgreens is right now. It was in that general area. That's where the Metropolitan was.
And we do have pictures of that.
We do have pictures.
So he spared no expense to build this elaborate theater. Supposedly this one cost $300,000.
Wow.
And it was an architectural marble. It had a gilded dome on the top of the replica of the State House in Boston. The theater seated 1,536 patrons. 250 of the best seats were personally designed by Mr. Trager. So you've got a seat, he designed the seat, and that was the best seat in the house. The auditorium was lighted by an immense dome light that had 70 bulbs in all different colors of the rainbow. This light fixture was originally designed for the Roxy Theater in New York City. Eventually got in the foyer of the theater, there were 3 paintings of comedy, tragedy, and music. These were painted by 3 artists from the Fetva and Goodruff studios of Boston. The painters were paid $30 an hour to paint these 3 things. So that's a good wage even nowadays.
That was a lot of money back then.
Way above the minimum wage. Yeah, and wherever possible, Mr. Trager used local contractors. Albert Brito, I think I know him, was in charge of the carpentry work. Cragen and Wilkins installed the heating and ventilation plant, and W.A. Fuller furnished the lumber. So Mr. Trager was not a person who knew anything about running a movie theater. He was a builder. So he had to hire somebody with experience to run his theater, and he hired a man named Dan O'Keefe. Now, Dan O'Keefe had previously been the manager of the Music Hall Theater when it was owned by Mr. Amazine. He lost his job when my great-grandparents bought the Music Hall Theater.
Right.
So he had to go other places to continue working. But he had 22 years experience when he came back to Leominster to run the Metropolitan Theater. He had originally worked with the Whitney Theater people who were in Fitchburg and Springfield, and I guess they're the ones that sent him as manager to the music hall. After the music hall, he went to Marlborough for a year, and then he had spent 3 years in Clinton at the Strand Theater, and that's where he was hired from to come back and run the Metropolitan. So obviously, he was in competition with the Plymouth Theater because he kind of lost his job when the McAvoys took over the music hall. He was originally from Salem, but his wife, Margaret Mulhern, was a Leominster girl. So he came back to town. And Mr. Trager wanted to hire local people, so he considered Dan O'Keefe to be a local person who had lots of experience. He also, I think Dan O'Keefe hired Ernest Metcalf, and for another stab probably at the McAvoys. He had been employed for about a year as the organist at the Plymouth Theater. Well, he was stolen away to work, and they had another $15,000 Robert Morton organ at the Metropolitan, and Mr. Metcalf came over there. And again, he was a local boy, so hiring local people. Opening night, the opening night was May 20th, 1929. In the newspaper, when my family's theaters opened, they'd have like one article about
Right.
them on the front page or something. But in this one, there was about a 4-page spread in the newspaper in addition to the front page having the article. So I'm wondering if Mr. Trager had paid to have all these different stories written about the different aspects of his theater. But they described the opening night. The theater doors were thrown open. That's the words that they used. And they had a 3-piece orchestra playing in the mezzanine for the first hour, while people could look around and see all the beautiful things that Mr. Trager had put into his building. The main program began at 8 o'clock. It had a talking mystery called Black Waters, and a Max Sennett talking comedy, Pathé Sound News, and Keith Vaudeville. According to that newspaper article, that they had exclusive rights to the Keith Vaudeville, but maybe there was different branches of Keith, but the Plymouth Theater also had Keith Vaudeville at there. So it's called BF Keith. This one, I don't know. But again, I think I can see some little, they're trying to up against my family that they did a little bit more. They also, they also had, and how many, they had a vaudeville program, but before the vaudeville performance, they had the VFW Trumpeters 12, I assume it was 12 trumpeters from Clinton. They were dressed in natty blue uniforms, and they played one selection, and then they had the vaudeville. That program lasted till midnight, so doors started at 8, so that was a long opening night
about a
program.
4-hour program, yeah.
And they had 3 projection booths there. The first one had 2 Simplex Type M projectors, the only ones in Worcester County, and a spotlight effect machine and a DeForest picture machine. I guess this is now an upgrade from the Movietone and Vitaphone. And this DeForest picture machine was invented by a Dr. Lee Forrest, who was already well known for amplification. He invented something called the Audion amplifying tube, and that made the radio, I guess in the old days you had to have earphones to listen to your radio. Well, this amplifying tube made radios be able to have speakers so people could listen to the radio. It also had something to do with long distance telephone calls. So this amplification system went into this DeForest picture machine, so it improved the sound quality of the sound pictures. Okay, so now we're at 1929, and I think it's kind of interesting. In 1929, the city of Leominster, which I don't know what the population was, maybe 20,000?
Yeah, probably
had 3 elaborate theaters, not just movie theaters, full functioning theaters that could do all kinds of stage plays. And it's amazing that such a small city could support these 3 movie theaters. It's also interesting that in 1929, so May 29, we've got the 3 theaters all going. We have the stock market crash in October of 1929. I don't know what kind of effect that
I'm
that
sure
had
it must
on
have made
things.
some kind of effect, because eventually some of these closed down or just slowed down from playing theater because people just didn't have the money.
Things changed. I consider in the 30s there were some problems, and we're talking about the Rialto Theater eventually closed in 1949. But before 1949, it did. It had periods that it had closed, and I have found, no one ever talked to me about the theater being closed. All right, I was born in 1944. The theater closed in 49, so I was 5 years old. The theater was open when I was a little kid. I know it was open, but when I was a baby, it was closed, I guess, when I was a baby. But I mean, I know it was open, and no one ever told me about it being closed. But there's these 3 interesting articles that I found in Leominster Enterprise. September 4th, 1930. The lease transferring the Rialto and Plymouth theaters from the McAvoy Amusement Company to the Plymouth Amusement Company was filed at the Registry of the Deeds. According to the terms of another lease, Rosina M. McAvoy has use for life of the apartment above the Rialto. So this is 1930. My great-grandfather, T.A. McAvoy, died in July of 1931. And I've recently found out that he died at a place called the Manusnock Rest Home, which was on West Street. So he was in a nursing home when he died. So this kind of tells me that perhaps he had been ill for a while. So in 1930, maybe he had taken ill, and that's when they decided they needed to do something to make sure she could still have her apartment above the theater. Now we've moved to 1935. There's a very small that the Leominster Savings Bank has started proceedings to foreclose the mortgage of the Rialto and Plymouth theaters. The buildings will be sold at auction on April 26th at 10 a.m. That did not happen. Okay. But what I think that the family did from reading these different things is we started with the McAvoy Amusement Company. They kept changing the names of their company. Then we have the Plymouth Amusement Company.
Right.
Then we had the P&R Theaters Incorporated, and then sometime between 35 and 46, they had something called the Leominster Allied Theater Corp. So I guess to avoid bankruptcy, they
Right.
just kept moving to different places. So but sometime in 1935, there were problems. The theater was closed. This goes to 1946 is the next article that I could find. January 10th, 1946, the headline, McAvoy family again controls theaters here. The McAvoy Amusement Company has leased the Plymouth Theater and the Rialto Theater to P&R Theaters. The offices of the new company are Edward L. McAvoy, president, and William F. Yeager, treasurer. For the past several years, the theaters were operated by the Leominster Allied Theater Corporation with Mr. Yeager as manager. Of recent years, the Rialto has been closed and the corporation often operated only the Plymouth Theater. The properties leased to the new corporation include the Rialto on Main Street and the Plymouth on Mechanic Street, and a large tract of land on Mechanic Street where a gasoline station is located. With the announcement of the new corporation, the McAvoy family resumes operating control of the two theaters, which were built by Rosina M. McAvoy and her late husband, Thomas A. McAvoy, president of Mr. McAvoy, president of P&R Theaters. That's Edward McAvoy. And Mrs. McAvoy's son, and Mr. Yeager is her son-in-law. Mr. Yeager said today that while there are still several possibilities under consideration relative to the reopening of the Rialto, plans are still in an indefinite stage. So
Wow.
in 1946, I was like 18 months old. So I just
Right.
they lived in the theater. I went there to visit my grandparents and my great-grandmother. But sometime between 46 and 48, when I would be old enough to know what was going on, the theater did, in fact, reopen.
And the last time that you were down here, we had talked about a photograph that you that I uncovered at the commissioner's office. It had you standing in front of the city hall behind your
I was with my grandmother.
Yeah.
Because we didn't talk about this time, but last time we talked about in 1951, my great grandmother was honored as the oldest movie exhibitor in New England, and a whole bunch of movie stars, led by Alfred Hitchcock, came and presented her with an orchid corsage on the steps of the Leominster City Hall. We had that picture has been around for forever, but I told you that I was there and I was standing behind Dorothy Lamour with my grandmother, and I was 7 years old.
Right.
Then so we had, but you in your drawers at the Historical Commission, you found another picture from that same event where the
what happened was I was scanning all these gazillion images and documents that I come across every day, and I found a whole folder that was kind of like on the bottom of the filing cabinet, and it all had theater stuff in it. And that's when I came across that marvelous photograph.
Because I knew that I had been there. I knew I was there, but I had no proof that I was there.
Yeah.
But Dorothy Lamour was at the microphone, and people had spread out my great-grandmother sitting there. And you can see by the edge, there's my grandmother and me, little girl, standing in front. The one big revelation to me was I said last time I did not know where my little brother, who was 3 years old at the time, was. I don't remember him being there, but he is standing in front of me in the picture.
Yeah, and I thought that was pretty cool when I came across that.
He was thrilled to find out that because he has no recollection of being there, and I have no recollection of him being there, but he was thrilled to find out that he had been there. So that's it. Wow. So now we know, I now have proof that I was actually present when my great-grandmother got honored, and I was right next to Alfred Hitchcock, and I don't think he said anything to me.
Is there anything else you want to get out there before we close out or anything, or you got everything we want to say today? Or?
Okay, well, there is more. Do we have more time?
I don't know. Do we have more time, Keith, or?
Need a little bit more time.
Okay. Okay. Well, the Plymouth Theater got sold in 1962. It was sold to a Mr. Cormier, who ran his business, the Blue Moon Cafe there, and eventually it burnt down. And the Metropolitan closed in '67. Do we have time to talk about my family? The McAvoy family has 5 generations of people who have involvement with the theater. Some with the local theaters, some went off into other careers. They have 3 sons and a daughter. All of their sons had careers associated with the movies, and as did their son-in-law. Edward McAvoy is their oldest child. He was involved. All right, this is something else we didn't know about. The McAvoys in 1910 to 1913 had a theater in Peabody, Massachusetts.
Okay,
And
wow.
my Uncle Eddie was sent to Peabody, and we don't know too much. The name of this theater was the Olympic. The only thing I know, they did in fact live in Peabody because his oldest child, Dorothea, was born in Peabody in 1911. At the time that the Rialto opened, he was considered to be the general manager. Later on, he became the president of P&R Theaters. But he left Leominster in 1936 with his family and took a position with RKO Movies. He was a
Okay.
movie distributor
Okay, wow.
in New York. And one of his granddaughters told me that, and she said, well, you better verify. I think it was RKO. So I Googled my Edward McAvoy, and I found in something called the Motion Picture Daily of 1939 that the Allied Theater Movies were having a World Fair exposition at the Hotel Astor in New York City in conjunction with the World's Fair, and they were opening it to the public, and listed my uncle as a member of the reception committee, so I know that he did in fact work for RKO. Then we have Albert McAvoy, the second son. All right, he mostly didn't participate. He left, the second son, he went off on his own. He was first owned and managed the Union Theater in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. In 1926, he moved to Attleboro, Massachusetts, where he managed the Bates Theater and owned and managed the Union Theater. And I also found that he did help get acts for the Rialto Theater back in the day. Arthur McAvoy is the youngest son. He went to Peabody with his older brother and worked at the Olympic Theater there. He met and married his wife Nellie Crean in Peabody, so I know that they were in Peabody. Eventually, he returned to Leominster, and he was the manager of the Gem, and he was the first manager of the Rialto and the Plymouth. But later on, he was the projectionist at both of the theaters, and eventually he became the president of the McAvoy Amusement Company. I think everybody in the family had a chance to be president of the McAvoy Amusement Company. It was kind of interesting.
Wow.
Now, William F. Yeager is my grandfather. He married Rosina McAvoy, the only daughter of the family. And again, they met at the Gem Theater. World War I hadn't happened. We might not be here.
Right.
And his life was totally changed by marrying into the McAvoy family. He was from Iowa City, Iowa. His stepfather had expected him to return to Iowa after the war, and he had him all set going to the University of Iowa.
Right.
But he had other plans. He met Rosina. They got married on January 15th, 1919, right after the war had ended. There was also the same day as the molasses flood in Boston. That's when they got married at St. Leo's Rectory. And then my mother was born on November 17th, 1919.
Right.
The family then moved to Iowa. But he didn't go to college because he came home with a wife and a baby.
Right.
So they were in Iowa for a while. Then the McAvoys were going to open the Rialto, and my great-grandmother missed her only daughter very much, so she offered my grandfather a job, and the Yeager family all came back to Leominster about 1922, and that changed his whole life. So he worked in the theater business for his whole life, and he survived all the McAvoys. He was the last man standing. Everybody else had died in the Plymouth Theater. So he's the one that put our family out of business when he sold the Plymouth Theater in 1962. And then we have the grandchildren. There are 9 grandchildren. 3 oldest children of Edward McAvoy. There's Dorothea Lee McAvoy Sandham. She graduated from Leominster High School in 1929 and then Smith College in 1933. She worked in New York City as executive editor of Movie Land magazine and the Screen Guild magazine. She also headed up the public relations for Roy Rogers. Her nephew, Gordon Updegraff, has inherited a number of photos of Dorothea with every movie star that ever was at the time she was editor of these magazines.
Wow.
And then her niece, Dusty McAvoy, has a letter that Dorothea received from Joan Crawford. I'm still trying to get this information from my 2 cousins.
And I've come across some people that the posters that Karen's talking about. I know people in Leominster that have those photographs and those actual movie posters. If I can let them borrow, let us borrow them, I'll take video of
pictures
those.
with her with movie stars. I do have my picture of. I forget what his name is, but I have a picture that my grandfather got me, Rock Hudson. I'm not in the picture with Rock Hudson, but I do have an autographed Rock Hudson picture. All right, now Earl McAvoy, he's the guy that made the movies. Graduated from Leominster High School in 1931, attended Dartmouth College, graduated in 1936. He lived in Leominster with his 4 siblings and his parents at 17 Academy Road. He went to Hollywood in 1938, and he worked as a screenwriter at MGM, an assistant director and a director. Then he went to work for Columbia for 3 years as a producer, assistant producer, and finally an independent director and producer in 1955. Unfortunately, his promising career was cut short, and he died of a brain tumor in 1959. But he was an assistant director of movies that people can see: Bud Abbott and Lou Costello in Hollywood, 1945, The Picture of Dorian Gray from 1945. I got to see The Picture of Dorian Gray on Turner Classic Movies, but his name isn't there because he was assistant director. But he did direct 3 movies. The first one, Cargo to Cape Town, starring Broderick Crawford, which premiered at the Plymouth Theater in 1950. Then The Killer That Stalked New York in 1950, starring Evelyn Keyes. And finally, The Barefoot Mailman, starring Robert Cummings. And about a month ago, I saw The Killer That Stalked New York on Turner Classic Movies. Right. It was really exciting. And there was this name, Great Big Letters, directed by Earl McAvoy.
Wow.
So we have a guy that made the movies. All right? And then we have his younger sister, who skipped a grade and graduated in 1931, same year as her brother. She went to Wellesley College, graduated in 1935. She worked in California. And one of the movie studios, we don't know which one, but she wrote several screenplays, including Judy in Easterland, which starred Judy Garland.
Wow.
And she also worked the publicity staff for Fred Astaire.
Okay.
So we branched out. Now, my mother worked at the theater as a ticket seller, and she was the backup ticket seller, so she was involved in the theater. And then the youngest grandchild is Arthur McAvoy Jr., and most of his career was spent in the plastics industry, but after his father died, he came to work as assistant manager at the Plymouth Theater for a couple of years, and he replaced Ray Butterfield, who was our longtime assistant manager, who left to go to the Metropolitan. He knew our theater was going to be sold soon, so Arthur McAvoy Jr. did get to be involved. I have 25 great-grandchildren. I'm the only one that worked at the theater. I worked at the candy counter starting at age 12 until I graduated from high school, which is when the theater was sold. And I did work there the last night the theater was open. Wow. And then all right, so that's great. All right, so now that 5th generation, I haven't counted up how many great-great-grandchildren there are, but Arthur McAvoy Jr., who I just mentioned, his wife Mary, had 8 children. They named them in alphabetical order until they had twins, who were named Patrick and Michael. So Michael is the youngest of the 25 great-grandchildren. Okay. Michael has a son and a daughter. His daughter, Lily, and his son, Lucas, are both child actors. And they last year had small parts in a movie called Daddy's Home 2. Oh, wow. So we got 5 generations of our family that have had something to, we have exhibited the movies, made the movies, and now we got the great-great-grandchildren who are in the movies.
That's pretty impressive for a family who came up from Leominster to make such a big impact in a movie industry.
So obviously
well-known
we're carrying on our love for the movie industry.
Right. Well, are we pretty much all done now? Can I close it out?
Yeah, you can.
All right, so I just wanted to thank Karen Byrne for coming in today and doing this wonderful interview with us, explaining to the viewing audience about the early history of Leominster theaters. We didn't quite get everything all out today, but I can always add it in later on. But I just wanted to give you a general view of where we were to where we are now. We're down to 1 movie theater now, and it's all done in multiple theaters within the theater itself, compared to, like Karen said, at one time he had 4 or 5 different locations all competing against one another. Now it's all in one place. And for those of you who don't know Karen, she came all the way from Natick today and to be here today with me and to do this nice interview here at Leominster TV. I'd like to thank Keith out in the back room who's filming this today, and Leominster Access Television, and the LTV family, and Carl Pimarini, Jack Sally, Robert, and the rest of the crew. I hope I didn't forget anybody, but overall, I want to just thank everybody once again, and to thank Karen for coming in today, and also for winning this award that I had received back in earlier this year for the movie industry. But anyways, do you want to say anything before we close, Karen?
No, it's a pleasure to work with you, Ron.
Okay, and you too. And if we come across any more information, we'll put it up on social media and share it with everybody. Thank you very much for having us today, Keith, and everybody. Thank you, LTV. My final thought. My name is Ron Gerard. My final thoughts and comments. The SAC Theaters opened in Leominster June 25th, 1969 on 45 SAC Boulevard. Originally, there were 2 auditoriums. In 1971, 2 additional auditoriums were built, bringing the theater to 4 auditoriums. Later, Auditorium 2 expanded and the theater split. The theater became a 5 auditorium complex. The theater eventually expanded to 10 auditoriums. After SAC Theater, the theater changed names a few times. It went from SAC Theater, USA Cinemas, Low Theater, Sunny Theaters, and eventually the Entertainment Theaters. In the past, the movies were once shown from a projector from a 32mm film on a 2-inch reel. Today, the movies come from the studios on a 40 GB hard drive about the size of an old 8-track tape. The 40 GB hard drive is then uploaded into a computer by the theater manager or assistant manager. In 2019, the technology changes once again. The movie industry will be downloading the movies via internet through satellite onto a fiber optic machine. I hope you enjoyed this documentary. This is Ron Gerard from Leominster Access Television. Thank you. Look at the theater projector today. And this shot you're looking at is where the projector the old projector would actually be showing a movie through a 35mm reel. It's a square little window. I'm pointing the camera directly at the movie theater screen, and you can see all the seats. Isn't that cool?
Loaded in there, and then they transfer to all the.
So do you when you're ready to put it on, like for noontime, when they start coming in here when it's time to show, that's already pre-programmed, I'm assuming, and the movie just automatically goes to the screen. It's not done through a camera lens anymore. It's just all wired right into the screen itself now, right?
The camera. These are the projector.
Okay.
Yeah. There's in front here, there's a lens. Still has the lens and all that stuff.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
See
Yeah.
backside.
And then we just load it into here for now. But now we're going to go satellite.
Okay.
Actual movie in
So
anymore.
this is your satellite thing?
It's going to be satellite.
Like
That's
satellite?
Yeah, they come in like this.
Okay.
Yeah. Have you seen one?
No.
Yeah, I'll open it up and show you. Yeah, no more 25-pound boxes of film. Boxes each. Like the old eight tracks or whatever.
So what is that actually called?
This is the I don't know what they call them. This is actually
So what like movie would that be?
Oh, this is Possessors of Hannah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that would be that would be like a movie where you're going to be showing it in the future.
Yep. No, it's playing now.
It's playing out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Load them and make them up with the previews and all that stuff.
Now you're the one that's doing this all yourself. Does anybody else help you do this stuff? Or you have to take
My
somebody?
assistant manager.
Okay, that's what they do.
Yep.
Okay, it's like on a weekend when you're doing a weekend when you have a day off or whatever. You do that.
Yeah. Well, they're only made up once a week, and then once they're made up, they're done.
So wait, for you to be here, where do you come from? Right here.
Some of the 10 is here, some of the 3 is here.
Okay.
So those are bigger houses.
And then